Hello, I'm Ron Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm providing some brief lectures and commentaries for the courses I teach in literary and cultural studies. This particular installment is one of several in which I'm discussing features of the historical period of modernity in Western civilization and comparing modernity to the European Middle Ages and also to the emerging conditions of postmodernity. I'll begin by saying some things about the changing economic structures of Western societies from the Middle Ages to the present. But first, let me define my periods. Historians and social critics generally divide the history of Western culture into three broad periods: the pre-modern, the modern, and now the postmodern. I'll be especially concerned only with the last stages of the pre-modern, that is, the European Middle Ages or the medieval period. The medieval period is generally seen as comprising the years between around 900 and around 1500 of the Christian era. The modern period begins around 1500 and ends around 1950, though that latter date is debated, and some scholars would place the ending date for modernity at around 1974. The postmodern era then runs from around 1950 or 1974 to the present. The economic system of the Middle Ages in Europe was feudalism. Feudalism is characterized by subsistence agricultural production and cottage industry craft guild industrial production. In a feudal economic system, virtually everything that is grown and everything that is produced by a local community is consumed by the same community. There is very little international trade. The feudal economic order is rigid and static. There is virtually no class mobility. The structure takes the form of a pyramid with a mass of peasants at the bottom and a very few, very rich aristocrats at the top. Opportunities for economic and social advancement in feudal society are very limited. Essentially, the only way to create new wealth in this system is to invade and conquer foreign territory. Beginning in the 16th century, the feudal economic order was challenged by the new revolutionary forces of capitalism. In England in the 16th century, there was a growth of international trade and a steady migration of rural peasants into the burgeoning mill towns where they worked as textile workers for the international wool trade. The 16th century is also notable for the beginning of transatlantic ocean travel and the beginnings of colonialism. Colonialism was made possible by technological advances in navigation techniques and in shipbuilding, but also made possible by changes in banking and financial practices and by technological changes in industrial production, such as is seen in the textile mills with the power looms, that made it possible to process much greater quantities of raw materials than had been possible under the cottage industry craft guild production system. The advances in industrial production, in systems of distribution, and in bureaucratic organization made possible by, and even made necessary by, the emergence of capitalism evolved by the 20th century into the system of large-scale factory production that we come to recognize as a hallmark of late modernity. The time and motion studies of the early 20th century efficiency expert Frederick W. Taylor, known as Taylorism, effectively enabled factory owners to turn the workers into extensions of the machine. Henry Ford's adaptations of Taylor's principles of scientific management and Ford's innovation of the assembly line, along with Ford's efforts to control the lives of his workers outside the workplace, and his strategies for turning the workers themselves into consumers of the products they built, have all had profound effects upon the lives of Americans in the 20th and into the 21st century. The alienating and dehumanizing effects of modern industrial and consumer society were widely recognized and registered by artists, intellectuals, writers, and filmmakers during the early years of the 20th century. Here are a couple of images from Charlie Chaplin's films Modern Times and The Gold Rush that, for me, capture the essence of the modern industrial system's alienating and dehumanizing effects and of the inadequacy of the emerging consumer society to deliver its promise of happiness and security. In this first image from Modern Times, Chaplin's little tramp is overwhelmed by the machine that he is supposed to be tending. He has literally been swallowed up by the gear mechanism, and soon the machine will chew him up and spit him out, just as the factory will send him back out on the street. In this second still image from The Gold Rush, I especially like the look of fierce determination and, I like to think, of outraged suffering and indignation as Chaplin prepares to dig into a shoelace as though it were a strand of spaghetti. I'll concede that to take this scene as an implicit critique of consumerism is no doubt to wrench the scene out of context. Nonetheless, that's what it always suggests to me. Eventually, the harsh conditions of Taylorism in the industrial system, in conjunction with recurrent economic crises, provoked a backlash. Trade unions organized a successful ongoing struggle for workers' rights in the advanced industrial societies. The last half of the 20th century has been characterized by advances in transportation, in communication, and information technologies, enabling a regime of production that some commentators are now labeling post-industrialism. But the term post-industrialism is somewhat misleading. It's not as though heavy industrial production has been rendered redundant and has disappeared. Instead, much industrial production and many kinds of information technology services, such as data processing, have been removed from the metropole and relocated in previously underdeveloped regions. This outsourcing of industrial production and many services has been made possible especially by advances in information technology and in transportation. But a no less important feature of the transition from modernity to postmodernity is the continued growth of consumerism. In La Société de Consommation, published in 1970, Jean Baudrillard argued that consumption rather than production, as Karl Marx had argued, now structures social relations in postmodern society. An extension of this argument, advanced by Baudrillard and others, is that in postmodern society, political empowerment matters much less than it did in modern society, because now the power to consume has displaced the power to vote. Many social and cultural observers and many politicians would now argue that consumption rather than production is the driving force of the capitalist economy in the advanced industrial countries, and that consumption is the defining feature of life in postmodern society. As always, if you have questions or comments as you're reading about and thinking about this topic, don't hesitate to send me an email.